I hit the breakroom floor so fast I didn't even have time to brace my fall. 1 second I was standing at the coffee maker, watching the dark liquid pour into my mug, and the next second, the cold tile was pressed against my cheek. The fluorescent lights above me buzzed like angry insects, too bright and too loud all at once. I could hear chairs scraping back in a sudden rush, the sound of feet moving quickly across the floor. People were rushing toward me. I could sense bodies getting closer, shadows falling over my face. Relief started to wash through the fog in my brain. Help was coming. Someone would lift me up, call for assistance, make sure I was okay. Then Cal's voice sliced through it all, sharp as broken glass. Touch her and you're fired. The room froze instantly. The movement stopped. The footsteps halted mid-stride. My vision blurred at the edges, sound fading in and out like a broken radio signal, but I could see shoes backing away from where I lay crumpled on the floor. Not one person bent down. Not one hand reached out to check if I was breathing. They all just stood there, frozen like statues, while their boss threatened their livelihoods. As the world tilted sideways and darkness crept in from the corners, one burning thought cut through the confusion. They weren't helping me because he'd told them not to. Nobody reached for me. I woke up on a stretcher halfway down the main hallway, fluorescent lights sliding past above my head like a strange dream. A paramedic with kind eyes was leaning over me, asking me to state my full name and the current date. My mouth felt dry as cotton, and the words came out slurred and wrong. Through the haze of confusion, I could see my coworkers hovering in the distance near the water cooler and the printer station. Their eyes were wide with shock and something else, fear, maybe, or guilt. Their arms hung stiffly at their sides like they were afraid to be seen anywhere near me. I recognized Liam's worried face and Brianna's hands pressed against her mouth in horror. In the ambulance, with the siren wailing above me and the vehicle swaying with each turn, I replayed the last month in my head like a terrible movie. The late nights that stretched past midnight, my desk lamp, the only light left on in the entire office. The lunches I'd skipped because there simply wasn't time to eat. The project Cal had dumped on me at 11:45 p.m. with a message that just said, "Need this by morning, no excuses." The way my hands had started shaking while I typed, fingers trembling so badly over the keyboard that I had to retype sentences 3 and 4 times. The paramedic asked if anyone at work had tried to help when I collapsed. I opened my mouth to answer, but the words stuck in my throat like shards of glass. How could I possibly explain what had happened without breaking down completely right there in the back of that ambulance? I turned my face toward the small window instead, watching the city blur past. This wasn't just about stress anymore. The next day, I sat in the HR office with a cheap styrofoam cup of coffee that tasted like burnt plastic and a headache that felt like someone had wrapped a tight metal band around my skull. Cal sat across from Keiko's desk, telling his version of the story like it was a minor inconvenience I'd deliberately caused to disrupt his productive morning. According to him, I had dramatically fainted during the busiest part of the day, disrupting important operations and frightening the entire team with my theatrical display. He used air quotes when he said the word fainted, like he didn't believe I'd actually lost consciousness at all. He called it a moment of emotional instability and suggested I was struggling to manage the normal pressures of a professional workplace. The HR representative, a woman named Keiko with perfectly styled hair and a frozen smile, nodded along like everything Cal said made complete and total sense. She typed notes on her laptop while making sympathetic humming sounds. She asked if I'd considered implementing better work-life balance strategies, as if I wasn't already drowning under the weight of Cal's endless, impossible deadlines. When I finally worked up the courage to mention his threat, repeating his exact words, "Touch her and you're fired," Keiko's face went completely blank. Her fingers paused over the keyboard. She looked at me like I'd just spoken in a foreign language she didn't understand. That was the precise moment I realized they were actively rewriting my story without my permission or input. Cal was spinning the narrative to make it seem like I'd caused an unnecessary scene, like I was the problem employee who couldn't handle basic job requirements. Meanwhile, Keiko was taking careful notes, and I could see phrases appearing on her screen, like difficulty managing workplace stress and emotional response to normal pressure. I refused to disappear quietly. Back in the office the following week, the break room felt like a crime scene I couldn't escape, no matter how hard I tried. The coffee maker sat in the same spot where I'd been standing when everything went black. Every time I walked past that exact tile on the floor, my stomach twisted into uncomfortable knots. People suddenly fell completely silent the moment I entered any room, their conversations cutting off mid-sentence. Their eyes would flick to my face for just a brief second before darting quickly down to their phones or their computer screens. I felt like I was wearing a sign that said broken or unstable in big red letters. I overheard one coworker, someone I'd always considered friendly, mutter to another person that I shouldn't have pushed myself so hard if I couldn't handle the workload. The words were almost identical to the phrasing I'd heard Keiko use in the HR office. Someone was spreading a very specific version of this story. Later that afternoon, Liam cornered me near the copy machine when no one else was around. He glanced nervously over both shoulders, checking to make sure we were truly alone, before leaning in close enough that I could smell the coffee on his breath. His voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "I wanted to help you that morning," he said, his words tumbling out fast and urgent. "I swear to you, I really did. I was already moving toward you when he said it. But Cal threatened all of us." His voice actually shook as he repeated the exact words. "Touch her, and you're fired." Hearing those words from someone else's mouth made the whole thing real, in a way my own fragmented memory hadn't quite managed. I wasn't imagining things or being dramatic or misremembering what had happened in my confused state. It had actually happened exactly the way I remembered. Cal had stood there in that break room and threatened every single person while I lay unconscious and helpless on the floor. I knew I wasn't crazy. I filed a formal complaint that same afternoon, sitting at my desk with my hands shaking so badly I had to stop typing multiple times to steady them. I documented every detail I could remember. The systematic overwork that had been building for months, the late-night assignments that made any kind of normal life impossible, the break-room collapse that had left me with a bruised hip and wounded pride. And most importantly, the threat that had kept my coworkers frozen in place like frightened statues. I hit the submit button and then sat there staring at the screen, waiting for some kind of confirmation that someone, anywhere, was actually listening to me. 2 days later, Keiko called me back into her sterile office with its motivational posters and fake plants. She barely looked directly at me this time, keeping her eyes fixed firmly on her computer screen while she delivered her carefully prepared response. She explained in a gentle, condescending voice that my perception of events might differ significantly from how others had experienced that same morning. She went on to hint, in the most diplomatic way possible, that my performance had actually been somewhat inconsistent lately. This was completely shocking news to me, considering I'd been carrying approximately half of our team's entire workload for the past several months. No one had mentioned any performance issues before this moment. She suggested almost kindly that I should consider taking some personal time off to decompress and gain some healthy perspective on the situation. Her voice was soft and concerned, but her underlying message was crystal clear as glass. This complaint I'd filed wasn't going anywhere at all. I walked out of that cold office with my stomach twisted into painful knots and a new understanding burning hot in my chest like a coal. They weren't there to protect me from anything, so I was going to have to protect myself. That night, I sat at my small kitchen table and opened my laptop with a sense of grim determination settling over me like a heavy blanket. I started collecting every single piece of evidence I could possibly find. Emails with timestamps showing 1:47 a.m. and 2:33 a.m. Messages where Cal had written things like, "Just one extra push and we'll be done." Followed immediately by 3 entirely new project assignments that would take days to complete. Calendar invites that were dropped on top of each other like a messy pile of papers, with meetings scheduled directly during my lunch breaks and well after normal business hours. Screenshots of chat messages where he'd asked me to work through weekends and holidays. Records of vacation requests that had been denied at the last possible minute. I took screenshots of absolutely everything I could find. I backed up all the files to a cloud storage drive, and then again to an external hard drive I kept in my desk drawer. I wrote down exact dates and times in a physical notebook with blue ink, carefully matching each incident with its corresponding piece of digital evidence. As I watched the folder on my computer grow larger and more organized, something fundamental inside me began to shift and change. The fear that had been sitting on my chest like a weight started to lift slightly. I wasn't scared anymore, or at least not as scared. Instead, I felt focused and clear-headed for the first time in weeks. My hands finally stopped their constant trembling as I organized all the files into careful categories: systematic overwork, verbal threats, retaliation attempts, potential witness statements. Each piece of evidence was like a brick I could use to build something solid and unshakable. If they were going to try to call me unstable or dramatic, I was going to arm myself with the one thing they couldn't easily twist or conveniently ignore. Documentation would be my armor and my weapon. The next morning, I stood alone in the main hallway, staring up at the giant framed poster that hung on the wall near the elevators. Bold black letters on a bright background declared with absolute confidence, "We prioritize people. Health, safety, and respect come first." I almost laughed out loud right there in the hallway. The irony was so thick and heavy, I could practically taste it on my tongue. I remembered the paramedic in the ambulance asking me if anyone at work had tried to help when I collapsed, and I felt heat flare up sharply behind my eyes. Angry tears threatened to spill over, but I blinked them back hard. I wasn't going to cry in the office hallway where anyone could see me. Instead, I pulled out my phone and navigated carefully to the company intranet site. It took some patient digging through multiple menus and subfolders, but eventually I found exactly what I was looking for: the official written policy regarding medical emergencies and employee duty of care. The language was absolutely crystal clear and left no room whatsoever for interpretation. All employees were explicitly required to render assistance to any colleague experiencing a medical emergency. Failure to do so could result in disciplinary action. The policy had been updated just last year. I sent the document to the printer, waited for it to finish, and then took the warm pages back to my desk. I highlighted all the key sections in bright yellow, making sure the most important phrases stood out clearly. Then I carefully slipped the marked-up pages into my growing folder of evidence. Cal's threat hadn't just been unnecessarily cruel and inhumane. It had directly violated the company's own written policies that were posted on their own official website for everyone to see. Their own carefully chosen words betrayed them. Later that same week, I ran into Brianna in the concrete stairwell between the 3rd and 4th floors. She was sitting on one of the steps with her phone in her hands, and I could immediately see that her eyes were red and puffy. Her makeup was smudged in a way that suggested she'd been crying for a while. When I asked gently if she was okay, she hesitated for what felt like a very long moment. Then the words came tumbling out of her mouth all at once, like water finally breaking through a dam. She told me about something that had happened approximately 6 months ago, long before my breakroom collapse. Cal had humiliated her during an important team meeting in front of at least a dozen people. He'd called her far too sensitive for this industry, when she'd very quietly and professionally mentioned feeling somewhat overwhelmed by her current workload. She'd been far too scared to file any kind of official complaint because she desperately needed this job to support her 8-year-old daughter as a single parent. About an hour later, Troy from the IT department stopped by my desk. He pretended to be troubleshooting some minor issue with my computer, checking cables and clicking around on the screen, but what he really wanted was to tell me something he'd been holding inside for months. The last intern who'd worked in our department had quit very suddenly and without any prior warning after having some kind of breakdown in the bathroom. According to Troy, Cal had apparently forced that intern to work straight through an entire weekend when the kid's mother was in the hospital recovering from surgery. These weren't isolated incidents at all. They were pieces of a clear pattern, bricks stacking up one by one into a tall wall of evidence. Cal hadn't just targeted me specifically. This was how he treated everyone. I invited several coworkers out for drinks after work that Friday, sending casual messages that made it sound like nothing more than a relaxed social gathering to blow off some steam from the week. The first half hour at the bar was filled with awkward small talk and nervous laughter. We discussed the weather, complained about traffic, made bad jokes about office coffee. Then someone mentioned Cal's name in passing, and the entire table went instantly quiet. You could have heard a pin drop onto the wooden surface. People exchanged meaningful glances, and I could practically feel the tension rising in the air around us. One by one, like a confession session, the stories began to pour out. Late-night phone calls that had interrupted family dinners and kids' bedtimes. Public shaming sessions during team meetings over tiny, insignificant mistakes. Threats about how there were plenty of qualified people out there wanting your job whenever anyone dared to push back even slightly on an unreasonable demand. Brianna talked again about her meeting humiliation, her voice shaking with remembered shame. Troy mentioned the intern situation in more detail. A woman named Simone described how Cal had forced her to cancel a vacation she'd been planning and looking forward to for months, just because he'd suddenly decided he needed her on a project. Hands visibly shook as people talked, their voices automatically dropping to careful whispers whenever someone wearing a business suit walked past our table. I sat there listening with my heart pounding hard against my ribs, a realization dawning on me with absolute clarity. We were all standing on the exact same landmine. We'd all been suffering in isolation, each of us thinking we were the only one experiencing this treatment, that somehow we were uniquely failing or inadequate. What if we all stepped forward together at the same time? The next Monday, I called the company ethics hotline from my car in the parking garage. Windows rolled up, engine off, phone pressed to my ear. I laid everything out for the woman on the line. The collapse, the threat, the retaliation from HR when I'd tried to complain. The voice on the other end sounded sympathetic. She promised confidentiality and said my concerns would be handled appropriately. I felt a tiny spark of hope as I hung up. Maybe the system would actually work this time. 2 days later, Cal called me into his office. He sat behind his desk with a thin smile on his face, fingers steepled like he was about to deliver good news. Instead, he mentioned concerning feedback he'd heard about my attitude and capacity to handle stress. My chest tightened. My anonymous complaint had walked straight into his hands. They weren't just ignoring what I'd reported. They were feeding him information. The backlash started small, like drops of water before a flood. My biggest client account was suddenly reassigned to Ryland to balance workload. A project I'd spent 3 weeks developing was handed to someone else the day before the presentation. All my hard work, gone. Cal began copying Keiko on random emails to me, phrasing every sentence like I was fragile or incompetent. He told me I should focus on smaller tasks for a while, pretending he was doing me a favor by reducing my responsibilities. It was subtle enough to look reasonable from the outside, but I knew exactly what it was. He was punishing me for speaking up. He was trying to push me out slowly, making my job so miserable and meaningless that I'd quit on my own. That way, he wouldn't have to fire me, I'd just disappear. Retaliation might be hard to endure, but it wouldn't be hard to prove. On my lunch break, I sat in a tiny office at a legal aid clinic 3 blocks from work. I clutched my folder of printed emails, highlighted policies, and handwritten notes. The attorney, a calm woman in her 50s named Miss Ford, listened without interrupting. She occasionally jotted down dates and times. When I finished my story, she looked up and said one sentence that changed everything. "You're not overreacting. This is serious." Relief washed over me so strongly I almost cried. She walked me through what counted as retaliation under the law. She explained what evidence would matter most and how companies typically scrambled when their biggest clients got dragged into workplace safety situations. For the first time since I'd hit that breakroom floor, I didn't feel crazy or weak. I felt strategic. All I needed now was leverage. Back at work, I remembered something Miss Ford had mentioned. She'd said, big clients often have clauses about workplace safety and ethics in their contracts. Our largest client, Horizon Industries, had a multi-million-dollar deal with us. I'd seen the contract binder sitting in the project room. I stayed late one evening, pretending to finish up some slides. When the office emptied out, I carefully flipped through the binder until I found it. An ethics clause buried in Section 12. It required our company to maintain a safe, harassment-free environment for all staff assigned to their account. Violations had to be reported immediately. My hands shook as I snapped photos of the pages with my phone. Cal hadn't just broken company policy. He hadn't just mistreated me and my coworkers. He'd broken the contract that kept this entire place running. He'd broken the contract that kept the lights on. The next week, Cal called me into his office for another one of his lectures. I walked in with my phone in my jacket pocket, recording app already running. He didn't notice as I set my bag down near his desk. He launched into his usual speech about how my emotional reactions were affecting the team. He mocked my collapse, implying I'd done it for attention. He said if I couldn't handle the heat, maybe this wasn't the right place for me. His voice dripped with condescension. Later that day, Liam forwarded me an email where Cal had written that I was barely holding it together and needed close monitoring. I listened to the recording through my headphones that night, my heart racing with each cruel word. Now I had his voice, I had his words, I had his lies, all captured and ready to use. At the next all-hands meeting, Cal stood on stage like he owned the world. Halfway through his presentation, he made a joke about some people needing smelling salts just because the workload got a little intense. A few people in the crowd laughed nervously. My face burned as heads slowly turned toward me. Cal grinned like he was untouchable, like everyone in that auditorium was his audience cheering him on. But as I scanned the crowd, I caught something different in people's expressions. Tired eyes, clenched jaws, people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. They weren't amused by his cruelty. They were exhausted by it. Simone glanced at me with an apologetic look. Troy shook his head slightly, disgust written on his face. Brianna mouthed the word sorry from across the room. He thought he owned the room. He didn't realize it was slipping away from him. That night, I created a private group chat with the coworkers who'd shared their stories over drinks. I laid out everything I had, the emails, the recordings, the contract clause, Miss Ford's advice about strength in numbers. I asked for one thing, the truth, in writing. People hesitated at first. The fear was real. Jobs were on the line, health insurance, rent money, the ability to feed their families. Brianna worried about her daughter. Troy had student loans. Simone was supporting her elderly parents. But one by one, they agreed. We picked a date and time. We would each send formal complaints through the official system, referencing specific incidents and copying HR leadership. Not just Keiko, but her bosses too. We would attach evidence. We would back each other up. If they wanted to call me unstable, they'd have to call all of us unstable. The morning after our complaints hit the system, Keiko called me in again. This time, her tone was different. Overly polite, almost gentle. She offered me a transition package, 3 months of pay and a neutral reference letter, if I chose to move on to new opportunities. The message was crystal clear. Take the money and disappear. Sign away my right to sue and never speak about what happened here. Go quietly into the night and let them sweep this whole mess under the rug. I asked for time to think about it, pretending to be unsure while my mind raced ahead. I walked out with the severance offer in my bag, and something more valuable in my head, the knowledge that they were scared enough to pay me to leave. They thought this was my price. They were wrong. A few days later, I came into work and discovered my access to certain shared drives had been mysteriously revoked. Meetings I should have been included in vanished from my calendar overnight. I was excluded from email threads about projects I'd literally built from scratch. Cal walked past my desk without looking at me, but I could feel the smugness radiating off him, like heat from pavement. It felt like the walls were closing in, like they were trying to erase me piece by piece before I could do any more damage. For a moment, doubt crept in. What if they won? What if all my evidence didn't matter? What if powerful people could just make problems disappear? Then I remembered Miss Ford's words and the group chat with my coworkers. I wasn't just fighting from the inside anymore. I had backup. A week later, my phone buzzed with a text from Ryland, our main contact at Horizon Industries. He asked if I was okay because I'd seemed off during a recent video call. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. I agreed to meet him for lunch at a cafe 3 blocks from the office. Sitting across from him with my coffee growing cold, I quietly explained what had been happening. I focused on how it affected the work and the team, not just my personal situation. I kept my voice steady and my facts straight. Ryland's face hardened as I mentioned the collapse, the threat, and the ethics clause buried in our contract. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the digital copy of our agreement. His jaw tightened as he found Section 12. He looked up at me and said, "If this is true, your company has a very big problem." That weekend, I spread everything across my kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle. Printed emails, handwritten notes, screenshots, photos of the contract, written statements from Brianna, Troy, Simone, and Liam, the audio recording of Cal's cruelty, a timeline that mapped out every major incident with dates and times. I turned it all into a clean, organized document. No drama, no exaggerations, just facts, dates, and evidence that spoke for itself. On Monday morning at exactly 9 a.m., I attached the document to an email. I addressed it to HR leadership, the ethics officer, and the general counsel. At 9:01, I sent a separate copy to Ryland at Horizon Industries with a simple note. For your awareness, given the contractual obligations outlined in Section 12. At 9:02, another copy went to the external legal contact Miss Ford had recommended. There was no taking it back now. By noon, the office was humming with a tension you could almost see. Senior managers disappeared into conference rooms with the blinds closed and expressions like stone. Keiko walked past my desk 3 times without making eye contact. The air felt electric, charged with panic. Mid-afternoon, I received an email informing me I was being placed on paid administrative leave, pending an internal review of recent matters. I read it twice, then a third time, letting the words sink in. They were paying me to sit at home while they tried to figure out how badly this could hurt them. For the first time in months, I wasn't the one scrambling to keep up or fighting to be heard. I packed up my desk in silence, and as I walked out the door, I felt something unexpected. For the first time, I wasn't the one scrambling. During my leave, people started reaching out. A former assistant I'd barely known sent me a message on LinkedIn. She'd heard something was happening at the company and wanted to know if I was okay. When we talked on the phone, she told me she'd kept everything from her time there. Notes, emails, a copy of a complaint she'd filed 2 years ago that had gone nowhere. The investigators hired by the board contacted me next. They asked careful questions and took detailed notes. I sent them my entire folder of evidence. I later learned they'd interviewed Brianna, Troy, Simone, Liam, and the former assistant. Each person added another layer to the story. Cal had spent years breaking people down, making them feel small and powerless. But he'd forgotten something important. He forgot some of us kept receipts. 2 weeks into my leave, someone anonymously forwarded me an internal email. It was a summary of a phone call between our executives and Horizon Industries. Ryland's company had stated, in careful legal language, that they were reviewing the continuation of the partnership, based on swift and appropriate remedial action. The contract with Horizon was worth more than our entire annual payroll. Suddenly, this wasn't about Cal versus me anymore. It wasn't even about workplace safety or doing the right thing. It was about money, the only language the board truly understood. His behavior wasn't just a moral problem they could sweep away. It was a financial bomb about to explode. On a gray Tuesday morning, my phone exploded with messages from coworkers. "You're not going to believe this. He's being walked out right now. It's actually happening." Someone sent me a photo of Cal being escorted through the lobby, his face red and his jaw clenched tight. Security flanked him on both sides. An hour later, a company-wide email went out. Leadership transition effective immediately. Zero tolerance for workplace misconduct. Our commitment to a safe and respectful environment remains our top priority. The words were carefully chosen, legally sanitized. Another email came directly to me from the board. An apology. A settlement offer. A hint that reinstatement was possible if I wanted to return. I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling satisfaction mixed with something like grief for all the years I'd spent tolerating this place. Then another email came in, and everything shifted again. The new email was from Horizon Industries. Ryland had forwarded my information to their HR department, and they were offering me a position. Better title, better pay, better benefits. But it was the last line that made my eyes sting with tears. We've seen how you handled an impossible situation with integrity, and we want people like you on our team. 3 weeks later, I walked into their office for my first day. My heart pounded as I met my new colleagues, but this time it was from excitement instead of fear. When I felt dizzy during a busy afternoon and had to sit down quickly, 3 people immediately rushed over. Hands reached out. Voices asked if I was okay, if I needed water, if someone should call a doctor. I laughed through the lightheadedness, and something inside me finally relaxed. My old boss had tried to make me untouchable, something his employees had to avoid like poison. In the end, he was the one nobody wanted around. And I was finally somewhere I didn't have to collapse just to be seen.